That's also what we have.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, strong. What's the our office? Are you keen for that? Yeah, okay.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. That's pretty.
Step.
Yes, I do. Okay. All right. Oh, I know. Yeah. So, yeah, so it'll really just. All right.
Yeah.
Oh. Signal.
Please don't use it. That's a distribution.
Yeah.
What's that New York? New York, yeah. I listen.
Let's make sure the green light's on.
So that's it. Getting out of the. We're on that to Right. Hazel also doesn't matter.
With that, oh, you're North.
I don't know. I just want to.
Oh, what's that? Okay, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But
Yeah.
I've been told you.
I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know if it was.
Yeah, I'm trying to go to a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was the first time. Yes.
Is that where you want? They'd like to see the stuff out there.
Good morning, please be seated. Okay. Thank you. My left.
Sure. For you.
So if you learn what.
I did that the other day.
It was either, okay, but we have to move this flag because I almost knocked it over the other day. Morning. Okay, good morning and welcome back to docket number 240808, the non-wire solutions process initiation phase docket. My name is Chairman Marissa Gillette. I'm joined not virtually, in person today by the Vice Chairman Bukowski and Commissioner Arconti. We're here for our second technical meeting in this matter, but our first in-person roundtable. We have two more to follow. So looking forward to the discussions today. We do have an agenda in front of us, and I will turn it over to our staff, Rory Butler, in just a moment to introduce and get us started. I do just want to remind folks that we have two additional in-person roundtables after this. We did issue a notice of technical meetings all in one. All three of the meetings were noticed there, as well as the topics we'd be covering at each. If I can ask everyone to kindly restrict their comments today to the topics, the four topics that were noticed. We do have an additional two meetings with a time to cover the additional topics. So specifically, we're talking about the process monitors task 1 findings and recommendations, the EDC's revised April 22nd memo on data requirements and confidentiality requirements, whether any system needs should be excluded from the process, and the rationale for excluding specific system needs and projects. So those are the four topics that we're generally covering today. And I want to thank everyone in advance for coming and your active participation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Butler to start us off with our agenda, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair Gillette. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rory Butler with Authority staff. Next to me is Steve Capozzi, who will also be helping to facilitate the discussion for today's meeting. I'll briefly go over our plan and objectives for today's meeting. And Laura, if you could put the agenda slide up. Thank you. So these roundtable discussions are being held at the request of the EDCs, Eversource and UI. So we're generally going to follow the topics as proposed by the EDCs. The plan for today is we have two main topics for discussion. We're expecting to have approximately 70 minutes to discuss each topic. Our first topic is the system need suitability criteria. So in other words, what are the established criteria for screening which grid needs represent an opportunity for a competitive NWS solicitation process? After wrapping up with our first discussion topic, we should have a roughly 20-minute break around 10:30, but we'll be flexible with the timing based on how the conversation is moving along. Our second topic for discussion involves the annual data filing. So looking specifically at the task 1 findings of the process monitor and the additional comments from the EDCs regarding the data filings. Our main objective for today's meeting is to continue the discussions that were started in the first technical meeting on June 20th and give stakeholders an opportunity to voice their perspectives and concerns on the topics in the agenda. There was some productive and interesting dialogue at the last technical meeting, so today's meeting should be an opportunity to look more closely at the issues and have an extended discussion. I want to note that we are trying a newer format, which is aimed at encouraging more open dialogue. So this is different than our normal Q&A format, and our experience so far has shown that there's a lot of value in this discussion-based format. A few quick items for everyone's awareness and to make sure the discussions go smoothly. We are broadcasting this meeting live on Bureau's YouTube channel, and the recording will be available after the meeting as well. Also, the meeting is being transcribed. We have a court reporter with us today, so we'd ask that you please identify yourself and your affiliation the first few times that you speak to help ensure we have a clear transcript, and it can also help folks listening in remotely. Please make sure your microphone is on when you're speaking. You should see a small green light, and that means that your microphone is on and you should be good to go. For today's meeting, we have representatives from each participating organization seated at the round table. These are not the only representatives able to speak today. The seated representatives are able to confer with other representatives or staff from their affiliated entities. If you do need to confer, please do so away from the table so that we can keep the conversation moving along. Also, other speakers are permitted to be recognized and speak. So if a member seated behind our tabled representatives wants to come to the microphone, please do so at the appropriate time. Identify yourself and your affiliation. And if anyone in the audience would like to contribute to the discussion, please come up to the podium and we will recognize you at the appropriate time. Again, we do plan to take a break this morning after our first discussion topic. The timing is flexible depending on how the discussion is going, but we're guessing about 10:30. And also, again, we have two main discussion topics: the system needs suitability criteria and the annual data filings. So for each discussion topic, I'll provide a brief overview. And after the overview, each of our participants will have an opportunity to provide a few minutes of opening comments on their positions on the identified topics. After these opening remarks, authority staff will move to some questions to prompt discussion among participants. And also, participants will be able to ask questions of one another as well. Okay, does anyone have any clarifying questions on the format of the meeting and the agenda today? Okay, great. So before we get started on our discussion topics, we'll do some introductions. So please state your name and affiliation. And if you don't mind, I'll start with you, Attorney Wheel.
Sure. Good morning. I'm Tom Wheel from the Office of Consumer Counsel.
Morning, Vinicius Rossetti from UI.
Cliff McDonald from NV5.
Good morning, Lavelle Freeman, Eversource.
Good morning, Gerhard Walker, Eversource. David Glady, Eversource.
Okay, great. Laura, could you advance to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'll give a quick overview of the system needs suitability criteria topic before we move to our opening statements and discussion. So first, to be clear, when we say system needs suitability criteria, we're talking about the characteristics of a system need that make it more or less suitable for a competitive NWS solicitation. Those characteristics might include, for example, the lead time of the project, the cost of the project, or specific engineering details of the system need. The suitability criteria form the basis of screening which grid needs should be subject to a competitive NWS solicitation. The REO7 decision established a flexible, process-based approach for the screening of NWS solicitation opportunities, with two key goals of the NWS process being transparency and the creation of a contemporaneous record of utility information and decision-making. The EDCs will disclose each grid need with the planned traditional investment of over $250,000 in the annual grid needs filing. To ensure review of the grid needs is efficient, the needs are categorized in three buckets: likely NWS solicitation opportunities, potential opportunities, and unlikely NWS solicitation opportunities. These buckets are based on the planned cost to address the grid need. Additionally, the EDCs make a recommendation on whether each grid need should be subject to a competitive NWS solicitation process. The EDCs are free to recommend that even likely NWS solicitation opportunities should not be subject to a solicitation if they articulate a clear and compelling reason. The process monitor and stakeholders will be given an opportunity to scrutinize the EDC's justification for excluding certain projects. The screening process in the REO7 decision avoids the use of arbitrary thresholds and broad categories of exclusion in favor of a more flexible and transparent approach. Additionally, disclosure of these investments by the EDCs should not be burdensome, as existing internal EDC processes already create documentation for most, if not all, investments that would be disclosed in this process. Okay. So the subject of today's discussion is how certain projects, such as, just for example, projects with relatively shorter lead times or projects that require ISO New England review, should be treated or reviewed in the NWS process. So we'll stop here and move on to our opening statements from each of the participants. So I would ask if the EDCs can get us started on, if Eversource could get us started on their opening statements. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So good morning, good morning, Chairman Gillette, Commissioners, Bureau staff. Thank you for giving us the opportunity for meeting here today and discussing the topic of the non-virus alternative program. And especially thank you, since this was, as you mentioned, at the request of the EDCs. As you know, the companies are in favor of non-virus alternatives, and we do still see some concerns with the current layout of the program, and hence, again, thank you for this opportunity to discuss these topics. Now, as pointed out as Mr. Butler, the first topic is the system need sustainability criteria. And here, from the company's perspective, our key objective is to make sure that this whole program is cost beneficial to the ratepayer. And when I say the whole program, we are looking at the overall cost of this program, the additional overhead, the engineering need, the review process, the RFP process, the bid process as a whole. So when we're looking at this, we want to make sure that projects that have the highest likelihood of succeeding enter this process. And as you've probably read in our comments that we filed, we are proposing slightly different thresholds, for example, on the budget size. This is just from experience, and I believe my colleagues from UI can talk a lot better about this in terms of what we've seen historically and nationwide be successful as a project limit. The company itself, for Eversource, can speak to this. In our other jurisdictions, we typically screen at a $3 million threshold. In New Hampshire, we have entered into an agreement with the Department of Energy to do a temporary valuation of a $1 million threshold. But all of these thresholds are significantly higher than the $250,000 that is proposed here. And our concern with this is that it creates an undue overhead and burden for the utilities and the process monitor side, and associated costs for the program, which are carried by the ratepayer, with a very unlikely success rate of those smaller projects to be successful in the end with a non-virus alternative. And since I think I was asked for short statements, I'll leave it at that, and we can go into the discussion.
All right. Good morning. Thank you again very much for this opportunity. As Mr. Butler said, this new model, it's been very interesting to discuss, to debate the ideas that we have upon all the dockets that are open. So specifically for here, UI also support the development of non-wires alternatives and all other technologies that could speed up the energy transition. So we are very supportive on that. Also, inside the company, we have 4 very interesting projects on microgrids, on batteries. So it shows in practice that the company are willing to develop and understand better the potential of these technologies to benefit the customers and our grid. And I echo Mr. Walker's speech on that. Our concern is to establish a process that is streamlined, efficient, and do not bring excess burden to the utilities, and making the process of making an investment longer and more, let's say, painful. So this is our main concern here, and that's what we are going to bring some examples to discuss on that. Regarding the threshold, we also believe that we could increase this threshold for possible projects. We have expertise in New York with our sister company there, and also in Maine. And we see that, for example, in New York, from 140 projects that we have assessed through the non-wires alternative project there, process there, only 5 passed through, and all of them are over the $3 million. And when we go to Maine, the process there is slightly different from what we are proposing here. However, we also had put into analysis over 50 projects, and we recently passed through one that cost more or less $5 million. So our concern is the effort that it takes, and in our belief, the higher acceptance rate of projects shows the success of this process. So I understand that we should be careful on what are the criteria that we use in order to select the most feasible or potential projects that could become a non-wire and be implemented. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think I'll turn it over to Attorney Wheel.
Thanks. Are we introducing ourselves every time we talk like we normally do? Tom Wheel from OCC. We agree generally with some of what both companies are saying here, in that it doesn't, I think what everybody should be trying to avoid is a process where every project over $250,000 is subject to the same kind of level of scrutiny, meaning we don't want to end up in a situation where we're spending tons of time on projects that realistically aren't going to be eligible for the process. That said, I think the way I'll back up and say, I think we also actually, in initial comments in maybe the REO7 docket, we're advocating for a slightly higher kind of entry point. I think we're at 500,000 rather than 250,000 maybe. All that said, though, we definitely appreciate and agree with the kind of secondary goal of this process of providing transparency and insight on an ongoing basis for just what's being built generally, sort of as a secondary issue to what could be a non-wires alternative. We do see, at least on behalf of OCC, administrative efficiency gains in a kind of process where we have a sort of ongoing look at what's ultimately going to be ending up as being sought for entrance into rate base as plant in service further down the line. So in other words, it does make sense to us in terms of administrative efficiency for us and Pura and other interested stakeholders to have a sense of what's being put into service or what's eventually going to be put into service as administrative efficiency savings on the back end when everyone has to kind of review this stuff when it rolls into rates. So anyway, from our perspective, the way to kind of right size this or streamline it would be to just make sure that it wouldn't be to necessarily adjust the $250,000 set point, but just to adjust the kind of level of review that gets applied to the likely the three categories, the three likeliness categories. If that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, Cliff McDonald, Optimal Energy. So yeah, definitely echoing everyone's thoughts here about working to make sure this is the most cost-efficient process possible and effectively identifies good NWS opportunities. No, I think the process outlined here does have some flexibility in that, as Tom mentioned, there are variable levels of scrutiny required, and certainly not, the way I understand the process as outlined, it's not that every investment at 250,000 or over requires a lot of analysis and bids on NWS. There's even for the larger projects at 1 million and over, I think there's an opportunity for a high level to screen out some of the projects that everyone agrees are not a good opportunity with justification. And this is some of this stuff, in my opinion, can help serve to kind of create a record that we can learn from going forwards in terms of what works and what doesn't work for NWS and improve the process and kind of as we all kind of go through this and learn what projects, are definitely not screening and what are.
Okay, great. So I'll give anybody an opportunity to respond to the opening statements if they'd like, but otherwise I'll turn it over to authority staff for more questions.
Okay, good morning. I'll start. My name is Steve Capozzi. I'm with authority staff. I guess just jumping, piggybacking off of what Attorney Wheel said and Mr. McDonald just mentioned about the level of scrutiny that might be applied to these different categories. And I think maybe one question is, well, what could that level of scrutiny be to these different buckets? And then where is that level of scrutiny, or where does that analysis need to be done? For example, does it need to be done before the annual filings, or can it be done after the annual filings? So the annual grid needs and data filings. And maybe Attorney Wheel, I'll ask you first.
Sure. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud. I think the range of scrutiny could range from filings similar to kind of compliance filings on the lowest end of scrutiny, just that there is a disclosure generally, and that people like OCC or other interested stakeholders would have the opportunity to review those and potentially file something seeking some greater level of review, or file commentary suggesting it be advanced somehow to the program administrator. So that would be, I think, kind of the lowest level. Which I guess the suggestion there is that the administrator might not even necessarily need to automatically review that level, like the lowest level of scrutiny, perhaps, without it sort of being referred. So somewhere, I think I see the spectrum as starting at that point and then going as far up as for something that's likely for something over $1 million, particularly that falls into the kind of categories that makes sense for a non-Mars alternative, that would be directly submitted to the administrator for review.
To follow up on what Mr. Wheel has, I think one of the key distinctions is, as you rightfully ask, is where is the scrutiny applied to the project? Because especially for us, and so Clady can talk about this in detail, is the timing of these projects, right? And I think we talked about this in the last technical section. If a $250,000 project gets identified in April, has to wait until the filing and then the review of the process monitor, or we can certainly say we go ahead with a standard solution that bakes a minimum of a year delay into a very small project. David, chime in on that?
I mean, I guess just two thoughts. I mean, one, I think we already do file our the work that we perform in some level of detail. He's describing it, but as far as transparency goes, I think we're certainly supportive of if there's more needed there to kind of show what that work is. Yeah, I don't see any issue doing that. It's the timing that I think is more critical. Is the work, this, $250,000, a lot of that work is usually within the year or year and a half. We're already either designing it or building it. So I think the timing is critical here with respect to that threshold that we're talking about.
I think that's a very important point to note down, that typically budget as a volume correlates with duration, timing on the project. And the higher volume projects, the substation upgrades, those are the ones that have the long lead times where you might have the time to bake in, or you have the time to do a non-virus alternative evaluation. And speaking for the company, we've done that before. Like, we do that on every major project. Internally, our existing process screens everything 3 million and above for non-wires, because those projects tend to have the timeline and leeway to put that screening in. So it's not just thinking about the dollars, but the associated time, and because smaller projects tend to be the faster ones deployed.
And if I may, in this point, I remember discussing this on the REO3 docket as well. I think I'll make some references because all the things are interconnected. And because of the establishment of this specific process, we are upgrading our planning process and inserting there in the moment that we are assessing all the alternatives to solve a problem that we find out on our grid, we are looking, we trigger the analysis of a non-wire. So this threshold, this is important because it's not only will trigger the reports that we are going to make for PURA and other stakeholders, but also internally while approving the all the projects that we need to do. And as was said here, assessing the feasibility of a non-wire will put burden, we put effort. We need to spend some effort on that. And because of this, we will be able to disclose later on detailed information on the assessment that we had, because this is part of the planning process as well. That's why the trigger of the threshold is important, not only by the time of the execution of the project, but also the effort to build all this documentation to show if a project is feasible or not.
Yeah, so yeah, I was just gonna add that, yeah, I think the timing issues consideration is important. I think the process design document does kind of envision exceptions for kind of the smaller projects, and I forget what if they're referred to offhand, I'm looking it up, but whereas if it's a smaller project and the need is within a year, it doesn't have to go through an NWS process. So just want to raise that. I think that those exceptions that were envisioned by the existing process design document. So just curious to know if that's enough, or if that's not a good enough exception. And
I'll just give you an idea, like, so I'll tell you like where we're at right now, like 2026 work right now is being essentially locked in and in the design process because of long lead material and those kind of things. So I think a year by itself is not long enough for the smaller work that we're talking about here, for sure. We're already in designing that, ordering equipment and what have you.
Okay, so, but that was I'm sorry, so the concern is that it would not have been identified in time for the filing, and right?
Yeah, I don't think the timing of the filing, right, would align with where we need to be with engineering and material. Ultimately get to a point where we can not be delayed in executing. It's like capacity work, for example, that that work is very much identified for the usually like 26 right now. We're locking that work in for 26. 27 is not firmed up yet. So I think at least a year and a half.
So you don't think you'd have those 2027 needs identified by the 2026 filing or the 2025 filing?
Right.
Okay.
It's very dynamic on the system.
Yeah.
I mean, customers might come in today and say, we're moving forward with a project. And 2 months from now, they can turn around and pull out, and now that whole need has changed in that area. So it's very dynamic. So our work on the smaller work is certainly, it gets more certain as we get, like I said, probably 15, 18 months. Anything longer than that, it's purely a projection. I could tell you what we're projecting, but we can't lock it in until at least we get a little closer.
So what would solve that in your mind? Is it a rolling, a way to do a rolling kind of NWS process if those needs comes up, or is it just a difference, mainly a difference in threshold?
I mean, I think we're open to talk that through.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's what I worry about is just being at a point where there's certain projects I certainly cannot delay, like a capacity project, for example. I cannot delay that project because it's gonna be detrimental to our system, to our customers. So work like that has to proceed. So I think we need to make sure that whatever process timing we put in place is just supportive and not hindrance in us being able to execute.
And I think maybe just to walk through, and I'm going to butcher the numbers, but just to walk through a rough example, right? If we identify a need, we have to do a certain amount of engineering to at least have the comparative cost, right? That might not be the full level of engineering, but we're not going to proceed with a full level of engineering until the NWA process is through. Now, I'm going to phrase this as the worst case scenario. We determine this is going forward as a non-wires. It goes out to RFP. 3 bids come in, they get reviewed, they get screened. 1 goes into contracting and the contract falls through. Now we're 9 to 12 months into that process. Now distribution engineering gets the project handed back, a year delayed, and has to do the detailed engineer. Now we've just lost a year on that project. So that's why we're arguing for the projects further out, because that's a scenario that can always happen. You can put the bid out, nobody bids. You can put a bid out, the contract falls through. And then we are madly scrambling, trying to catch up with the traditional solution. So that time frame, as we're envisioning that RFP process, needs to allow for that to fail, that RFP process, because and again, UI can probably talk to this from their experiences in Maine and New York. It does happen that you don't end up getting bids for RFPs. And so then you're stuck with that lost time.
I'll just add, I mean, I don't think we want to be in a point where we're working in parallel either and spending the time and money on both avenues, and then that goes to our ratepayers. So I think that's what we just need to think about. How do we align that so we could achieve what we're trying to achieve with non-wires, but yet not be in a position where we can't execute on critical work for our customers and for the system.
And before heading to the next question, I just wanted to one quick comment from Mr. McDonald early on when you mentioned with the different unlikely potential to and likely scenarios to learn which ones work out well. And I just want to point out, like, we're in the very unique position that other jurisdictions have tried this already. And to UI's point, the data very clearly indicates that below $3 million, the non-wires don't fly. We don't have any or not a large quantity, at least not in the companies represented here, where this happened. So and I don't think we have to go reinvent the wheel here. We can take a look at what thresholds have worked in other jurisdictions and apply those here.
Can I just jump in just just to add a little different perspective on timing? I totally understand, and I agree. We would also want to avoid a situation where there's a year wasted on with nothing coming from it and a delay to that degree. But there's also timing on our end. To your point, Mr. Glady, we see Eversource plant applications entering service on a yearly basis through the ESI. We see that in January at the latest, and then we have to weigh in on it 2 months later for the first sector of that proceeding. Also, what we see in those proceedings is already done, and we don't see anything prior to that. We haven't seen a capital plan from Eversource since 2017, so we have no idea what you guys are doing. But so the timing from our end is we have either a couple months for the kind of window that we see that's already completed within the capital tracker, or we have 360 days in a base rate case to see everything, to see everything that's entered service over the past like 7 years. So we're very sensitive also to the issue of having enough time to actually get this stuff done. But it's from our perspective, the tension is we don't want to get in your way, but also the faster stuff happens out there in the field without us seeing it, the harder it is for us to support it in rate cases. And that's the positions we've been taking, as UI is well aware, is like, how can you're giving us, hundreds of pages of spreadsheets. We can't tell whether this is prudent. And everybody, I think, deals with that, including the companies, of like, you have this window of time in a rate case for everyone to kind of get on the same page on this stuff. So that's I don't know. I just wanted to highlight that's the other end of the timing issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the company's perspective, transparency, I think is what I'm hearing, right? I think for me, that's different than the NWS process. And I think there's opportunity to work with you or with the commission on what that needs to look like for, what our capital plan. And it's probably not in sync with what we file with the commission and what we ultimately set in the company from a timing. But I think there's opportunity to look at how we can get over that hurdle versus what we have to officially go through an NWS.
Yeah, I think to echo that point, if it's a visibility question, just to make projects visible, we shouldn't force them through the NWS process, right? Because that has the potential of increasing overhead, delaying the project. If it is simply a visibility question, I think that's a discussion maybe for the IDSP docket to say what level of visibility is needed there, but we shouldn't be putting them through the NWS process just to make them visible.
And I know we've said this, but I just want to just drive the point home that the delays that we're talking about have real consequences for reliability. And when we're planning these projects, we're looking at need date and lead time. And especially with these smaller projects that really need to go into execution quickly. And if the process creates a delay, it's not just about wasted money, it's not just about wasted time. It's about the possibility of customers not receiving service. It's about the possibility of blackouts. And that's my worst nightmare. So let's keep that in mind when we're talking about developing a process, because I think the thresholds matter. From a personal perspective, I think this is important. It's important for us to develop NWS. Dr. Walker commented that we have a process that we've set up. It's actually codified in our distribution planning criteria that we will consider NWS for any qualified need. But for that, we're looking at thresholds mostly around substation upgrades, where we have that runway to develop, maybe to fail, maybe to accommodate some market participation that doesn't quite pan out. But when you begin to compress those timelines, it becomes a real reliability risk. And so let's just keep that in mind.
I'll just quickly add in here, and I understand these concerns 100%, and it's definitely important. I think part of the hope in NWS, and I know they're looking at this in Rhode Island and a few other jurisdictions, is that it has some flexibility. It is a little bit more flexibility to ramp up and ramp down some of the solutions in response to kind of uncertain capacity forecasts. And I think part of the hope, one of potential use case for NWS, part of the hope is what this planning process can happen long enough in advance where you can identify potential circuits and circuits that are seem like they are likely to be growing and in the future have capacity concerns. Maybe you're not at the point yet where you would do kind of a supply side supply side solution to add capacity or upgrade the substation, but maybe you can get more advanced, further out in advance ahead of these potential constraints. So I think, that's part of the hope and one potential use case of this, that maybe maybe is what's driving some of the smaller, projects and desire to look at those.
Yeah, I think if I can quickly chime in this. So I agree, right? For the longer range projects, this makes sense, but and now we're going a little bit into the forecasting topic, so I do need to chime in on this. For forecasting, and this is distribution circuit upgrades will never be planned out 5, 6, 7 years in advance, because forecasting gets inherently less accurate the smaller your sample size goes. There's the best example is if you roll a dice and I ask you to forecast what number that is, you have a 1 in 6 chance of being right. If you have 1,000 dice and I ask you what the average number is going to be, you're probably going to be pretty good at guessing what the average value of those 1,000 dice is going to be. And so as you look at the customers, 10 customers on a circuit, and you're trying to forecast that behavior, that'll always be wrong. If you're looking at tens of thousands of customers at a substation, we can forecast that out to a high degree of certainty out 10 years. So the size, this is all interlinked, right? The size of the asset, the many customers it serves, the further out we can accurately forecast, the further out we can accurately plan the projects. And we need to, because the projects are coincidentally also bigger and take longer to deploy. So all of that's interlinked. So I don't think there's going to be a time where we're forecasting distribution circuits accurately enough to authorize projects 10 years out. That's not going to exist.
I just want to, Mr. Glady, Mr. Freeman, you both mentioned small projects. How are you defining sort of small projects? I mean, is it by, or maybe it's a combination, cost, time of need, project type or need type? I mean, is essentially everything, are smaller projects essentially everything but, substation upgrades or things like that?
Well, I guess there's a number of ways, right? Like you just alluded to, but yeah, generally for us, it would be cost would be the first thing. So for us, anything under $500,000, anything 500,000 greater gets a full project authorization document that goes through like all the things we consider, alternatives, all those kind of things. Anything under that does not. But I think then secondly would be timing. It's usually timing for us. It would be the second big driver for smaller projects. But I say that, but even like, an area that I might have to go out today, let's say there was a asset health condition and I had to reconductor a small section. I mean, it's roughly what, if it's single phase, it's probably $500,000 to $700,000 just to do, small lateral. If I had to do a 3-phase backbone, it's probably almost $1 million, a little over $1 million a mile. So that's not a big project for us, but dollar wise, it adds up quick.
Are sort of time of need and cost sort of correlated?
Correlated and level of execution probably is another one. So, smaller projects generally don't have the longer lead times and things of that nature tied with them. It's usually stuff that we have more readily available equipment. The bigger projects, substation, what have you, usually get into more complexity, permitting, all those kind of things that would drive bigger project. Smaller ones, we generally have the ability to go out and execute on those, and they're usually driven by, like I said, customers change quite dramatically for us. Their schedules change, and we have to respond to the customers, so their work changes as well.
But is it always the case, or I'm trying to think of the best way to ask this, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that, so the company sort of has probably a whole laundry list of projects that they want to complete, and you probably can't fit all in your budget. So is it always follow that small projects have to have a time of need? There may be some where the needs are flexible or can be extended.
Yeah, I mean, the other way to look at our work, if you look at our annual work capital wise, you would, walked you through that, you would see a large portion of our work capital wise that we spend every year is on emergent, asset health, customer driven work. That's the largest, financial. Everything else is we get into more what we call specific projects. Those are generally the projects that we're talking that are the year and a half out, that kind of stuff that we're designing. And they're usually, not all, but a number of those are usually over the thresholds we're talking about because they're usually more complex and more larger from an execution.
Okay. So I guess my general question is, how do we ensure, if to the extent the suitability criteria proposed by the EDCs, they exclude projects sort of at the outset. How do we ensure the goals of transparency and sort of contemporaneous record keeping of utility information, is achieved? Or how do we maintain that transparency?
Well, I guess in my mind, there's two things. One, we already do it today. We do file I know it's probably timing wise for the OCC. It happens after the fact, but we do file all of our project authorizations, anything over 500,000. So I do think that's one way, because in there we do capture all the alternatives that we consider and the decision making around why we did those projects. The timing of it probably doesn't align with, what I've heard, but I think that's something we could, maybe talk about is how can that be better adjusted to meet the transparency?
Yeah, and just to point I made earlier, right? I think if it's a discussion of transparency and making projects visible, as Mr. Clady has said, let's have that discussion and see what works best and how we can get to that level, especially that we can address some of the concerns of the OCC and of Pura staff. But using the NWS process as that vehicle where they have to go through that review process and puts a project on hold for our side until that process is done, I don't think is the right way of achieving that.
I was about to mention that somehow we need to figure out how to make things fit, because as I mentioned, we are under the system planning, the investment planning process. we are establishing a gate there to analyze if for such an issue that we have, if a non-wire could be feasible. Because for us, a non-wire alternative, non-wire solution, it's nothing more than a tool on the toolbox that the utility have to solve a problem. So for the sake of transparency, we are establishing this internally, and every project that again complies with some thresholds that we are discussing here, so things are somehow linked. But after these thresholds are established, every project then enters for our assessment. A non-wire would be assessed there internally. Okay, it's not on the non-wires process that the market will propose a solution. However, internally, we are looking at the problem that we have in hand and not ensuring, but assessing if a non-wire could be feasible there. And all of this documentation, all of this assessment will be held on the company files. And this is a very important documentation for when we are going to rate cases, supporting documentation to actually underpin the request for investment that we are doing there. So to my point is that because of the non-wires process, we are establishing this internally, and we are going to produce internal reports on the feasibility or not of a non-wire solution. But to Gerhard's point is that this is internally, and we are not stopping the project. We are not like halting it, wait for third parties to run any assessment on that. And for maybe a couple of months later with the answer that, okay, the market cannot pursue that alternative. And then we wasted our time. So just for the matter of the discussion here, this is one thing that we are developing on the planning. So, and we, for sure, we could provide this. But to my point is that I understand the role of the authority of this process is to establish clear rules on filings that the company must comply. So, and this is annually or whatever the time base that we define here. But on continuous process, both companies will need to assess each issue like every day, because we are seeing problems on our grid like in a day-by-day basis, and we have the processes established to define solutions for that problem. And on that, we consider a non-wire solution for that.
Just one more thing around the transparency, because I don't want to leave you with like a false sense. As much as I could, put forth all the work we're going to plan on doing, there is work though that happens throughout the year that comes up that's unplanned that I have to go do. So don't want to leave you with like, I could submit everything to, let's say for 2025 and send you everything now and say, that's it. It's not it. I was just down in Stanford yesterday looking at some overhead lines that we're going to have to go do something about those lines now. And, it's going to be $1 million. So the larger work for sure, that work generally is pretty firmed up, doesn't usually timing, barring usually some equipment issue or, material orders. But other than that, it's the smaller stuff generally is very dynamic in a year.
Mr. Capozzi, I'm sorry, Mr. Glady, actually 2 questions ago, Mr. Capozzi had a question for you that I didn't understand your response to on the smaller projects issue. I think I understood Mr. Capozzi's question to be, are there like types of small projects that do get longer lead times, or are they necessarily always going to be emergent projects that have to happen within the year? And I understood the response you gave, but I don't think you quite touched on that part of the question.
There are some smaller projects that will have longer leads. So smaller dollars with a longer lead. Yeah, there's a subset of those, but it's usually material delays, that kind of stuff. That would be the reason why we couldn't execute on it.
Okay, so it's like supply chain issues,
Yeah.
not like associated with the tip or a specific type of system need or
Not when you're in the 250 range, 500. I can't think of offhand too many projects like that that are, it's usually material related. That's usually going to delay us. Most of those get executed on in a shorter time frame. The larger projects for sure, those are definitely more longer term, planned out, the whole bit.
Thank you. There's been some pretty persistent supply chain issues over the past couple of years.
Yeah, so three-phase transformers for us is still quite the challenge. We don't see that correcting for at least the next couple of years. And what we also call pad-mounted switches. If you ever look at development, you see these green boxes. Those are pad-mounted switches. Those are all at least a year. And cost-wise, that switch is about $150,000. But those are some examples. So if we came up, say a customer wanted to come in and put a new apartment complex and you needed 3 of those, that may not be a year and a half out, that kind of thing.
Oh, right. Thank you. So do you envision the process, the NWS process today being flexible enough to say, well, there's a subcategory of smaller projects that right now we're facing transformer delays. So for like the next 1 or 2 cycles, we are going to consider those projects for NWS solutions. But maybe in 3 years from now, when the supply chain issue is corrected, that comes off the table.
Good question. I still think it's back probably to what our experience is though on projects that qualify.
Guys, I would just add to the point. I was thinking exactly along the same lines when you just put the question up, but that doesn't actually solve the issue because we wouldn't go purchase the equipment until the NWS process is through. To the earlier point, that we need to have clarity whether the NWS solution is procured or not. And so to my first example, if it then doesn't get procured, then we would be delayed on an already delayed purchase with the long lead times. Unless we go ahead and do the purchases anyways while the NWS process runs. And then to what Mr. Glady had said earlier, that might not be in the intention of the entire process because then you're procuring the equipment to buffer for the delay times while you're going through the NWS process. And then the worst case scenario for the ratepayer changes because then the NWS goes through and you've got the equipment on hand.
Totally understand. I guess I was thinking that there were like a subcategory of type of equipment that you just always need in the system. Like certainly we've had discussions about transformers and meters and how they start to depreciate from the moment you buy them. Like, so I guess I was wondering if there's just a certain type of equipment that you're always going to need. So there's not necessarily ratepayer harm if a one-off project develops as an NWS.
I mean, there certainly is a level of equipment we always need, but I still think it's back to that time. It's like I said, it's very dynamic with customers and more of electrification as it occurs. I mean, just the other day I saw, I think it's like 10 projects now just came in for more, EV charging. Those are all going to require 3-phase transformers, lead times out there, things like that. And it changes very, very dynamically, that whole window. So it's more of that customer stuff that really impacts us from a timing.
Thank you.
And I think just another comment. We shouldn't. This is the conversation is a bit complicated, and we always get into like single topics. So to get back to the cheaper equipment, the smaller projects that could execute faster, or we could, as you have mentioned, have certain amounts of equipment in stock and then roll out quickly. Because the projects where the equipment has the least amount of lead time are probably the most suitable ones for NWS because you can correct if the process fails, right? So the problem is those are the cheaper projects. And so I'm just going to make up a number now. Assume the entire NWS process creates an overhead of $50,000 from utilities, our side preparing the RFP, process monitor side sending the RFP out, reviewing the bid, contracting until it's in it, and adds another $50,000. So for a $250,000 project class, every 5 projects would need to be successful in order to break that even. And given the experience we've seen in all other jurisdictions, 140 projects, none of them under $3 million, I'd say that's a risky gamble. So that's the other aspect of it, right? For a $4 million project, the $50,000 overhead to send the RFP out and do the procurement is a rounding error in the percentages of what that project is. So if one out of five of those is successful, you will recover all those costs through the savings. On the smaller ones, you need a very high success rate to be able to recover that, and we're not seeing that.
I appreciate that. Maybe if I could stay in the rabbit hole just one more minute and I'll get
Alright,
back
sure.
to staff. So in the example of electric vehicle chargers, having worked for an engineering firm that did designs of those systems for the Pepco service territory, there's a bit of a I don't think roteness is a word, but you draw the riser diagrams and everything, and you're still doing the analysis at each location, but there's a little bit of cut and paste at some point. Just thinking creatively, instead of exempting the entirety of these smaller solutions, is there like a type of project like electric vehicle charging that you project that you'll see for the next 5 years at a high rate, and you can design an NWS solution ahead of time that you could just quickly evaluate for those smaller projects because they're, generally cut and paste. I don't know if that question makes enough sense to respond.
No, I'll start from the NWS screening side. So I think that's exactly what the companies are doing with their internal NWS screening tools and processes. Those allow us to go very quickly through those without putting them out to an RFP, right? So that's the difference. We have some standardized assumptions. We use, for example, NREL databases for cost assumptions. We look at storage, energy efficiency, demand response. We screen that through. If it doesn't pass, we don't continue. If we find a solution, then it would go to, if we're procuring a 4 megawatt battery, we would go to RFP and purchase that. We don't build batteries, or we don't manufacture batteries. So we have to buy that anyways from the market. So that we have internally, those are the existing processes internally. And I think UI would agree with that. That's kind of how you look at it, and some standardized assumptions. Again, I think for the projects that occur hundreds of times over in the future, those will be the smaller projects. And then the question is, again, is that NWA going to recover the costs it creates? I'm very much aware of that. If we pull those levels up, as the utilities are proposing, we are likely going to miss a couple of NWAs. That's that's perfectly clear. The question is the effort to go find them worth it, the benefits they're going to bring?
Thank you.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I don't want to add much, but I'll just say, I think what we try to outline, and I think I would support, is why not we already do it under the project authorizations, document our review of NWS for 500,000 or greater. One that shows some transparency, shows our thought process, why we felt that we couldn't do an NWS. I still think the timing is the big driver here, though. A lot of these projects we're talking about will just change very dynamically. How does that then support NWS? So we're not duplicating effort, wasting customer cost. That's the piece I guess I personally get hung up with seeing. Even if I can come up with, say, yeah, I can do this at this site, if I have to run it through a whole process to go out, that I can't assure that work is necessarily going to start.
Okay, so the objection, not to oversimplify it, but the objection is around the actual issuance of the RFP, not because your position is that you're doing an internal screen for NWA. Yeah. So the objection is to the part of the process that's the issuance of the RFP for the small projects.
Right. And the timing and execution of all that to ensure we're not wasting time and wasting cost. These smaller projects, I think, is what I personally just wrestle with. How are we going to do that here on these smaller projects?
Thank you.
Can I just, sorry, so I'm trying to understand the concerns here, because, right, a lot of what we're talking about, I think, would fall mostly under unlikely NWS solicitation opportunities and maybe some under potential. But, my understanding is most of the unlikely and potential solutions would not be going to, the internal screen would be envisioned as sufficient for that. I think the exception and the worry maybe is when there's kind of an emergency basis and you have a need arise during the year where the timing doesn't align with the filing. I think that, there's an exception built into the NWS process design. I mentioned earlier, the emergency unplanned investments. And there, I'm looking at it here, it does kind of account for reasonable delays such as supply chain issues. So I'm wondering, is the concern maybe more along that you're worried that that exemption is not sufficiently broad?
No, I want to keep it a little bit higher level, right? As you mentioned, there are exemptions in there which would, for the unlikely NWS projects, it is unlikely, as the name says, that they would go to RFP in the process. Yet still they have to be filed and reviewed by the process monitor whether they go to RFP or not. Going back to Mr. Glady's point, until that is done, we can't proceed without risking the recovery and an imprudent judgment on the investment. So we have to hold that project until that screen is done. So maybe to Chairman Gillette's point, maybe the solution out of this that's worth discussing is that the utilities, using their existing processes and feedback and input from the stakeholders and the authority and PRR staff, is to say we do the internal screening for those, and then those get reported just as a reported, not as a wait for decision kind of deal, to provide what Mr. Wheel is looking for the visibility, and we install a higher threshold, let's call it the $1 or $3 million threshold, that actually goes into the process, that then gets reviewed by the process monitor, that then go to RFP. That would allow the utilities to act very quickly on those smaller projects internally with the existing processes, and like I said, we'd be open for inputs on those and how those work. And those is just a visibility filing, without waiting for an approval, so that we can keep the ball rolling on those.
Can I just, Tom Wheel from OCC, again, I totally agree, and that's a more eloquent way of saying that what I was trying to say 10 minutes ago, in terms of the process. I think that makes a lot of sense. I would just add, yeah, I think particularly for smaller projects, the visibility and transparency is important to us for the secondary reason that I talked about before in terms of cost recovery review, but also it would, the way I see it, it would give all stakeholders an opportunity, at the risk of I don't want to sound blunt, but the utilities concerns are you guys don't want to be held up on moving forward on these small projects. And I agree, I don't think you should be held up, but it would potentially give the opportunity for someone to interject and say, hold on, this, like, we have, on this particular one, we have some ideas. And maybe that doesn't even necessarily mean that there's an automatic holdup. Maybe there's an opportunity for, there's a back and forth where the utilities explain, yeah, we don't think it makes sense to move forward that idea. But I totally agree that it, and I don't actually think that that anyone disagrees, as I understand the structure of the program now, that there necessarily needs to be a kind of a stop and a review before the utilities can move forward. But I do understand the concern that I understand the timing concern that if there's a small project that you run a risk of saying, well, what if someone does tell us hold up, then the money we've invested so far is going to be at risk. So I guess what I'm saying is I agree that this can be resolved potentially procedurally, like through like what it is that triggers higher levels of review.
Okay, let's see. I think staying with the cost issue. So the company's affiliates have experience with different cost suitability criteria in New York and New Hampshire. Can you speak to those? Maybe we can start with Mr. Rossetti.
Sure. So I'll attend to all my knowledge from New York. So I oversee UI. So speaking with my colleagues, if you have further questions, I can for sure go with that. The process there in New York was established, if I'm not wrong, like 2016, something like that. Quite a time that was established there. And on that process, all load relief projects should go through the NWA process there. do not recall, and they are the only ones. The other, we are going to talk about suitability criteria. The program there is more, let's say, strict on scope for the load relief project. Other are excluded from that, but I'm not sure about the threshold of financial threshold. That's why we have many projects that must be assessed through the process there. And one thing that is interesting highlighting here is that in my perspective, and what I was discussing during this process is that load relief projects are one of the most suitable, let's say, for non-wire, because we are talking about peak shaving, we are talking about maybe a battery entering there to hold the system for a short period of time. So in generally, one of the best use cases for a battery here is for load relief, right? And what we are seeing there, we are investing effort on the process along all of these years in an extensive analysis on that. And what we saw is that for actually the fifth just passed through, but in this time, 5 projects passed through and they went for bidding, and we are receiving feasible bids for that. So in my view, when we have extensive, a complex process like this, and we need to analyze like hundreds, and only a few are approved, it raises a yellow or red flag for us. Is the thresholds well set up? So this is one point that I like to bring to the discussion here, that we have this in New York and also in Maine. In Maine is a process a little bit younger. There is a different process. I think it's a much less flexible process than what we are proposing here. And even so, we have more or less 40 to 50 projects entering that process, and just one was feasible. So how all of this effort is actually worth it? And then when Mr. Walker come with the idea that we established on the other companies the process that we are establishing here at UI. So we are copy and paste, with, for sure, the adjustments that are needed for the Connecticut reality. But there's this internal screening process that already tries to figure out if a non-wire could be an alternative for a given problem. And going through that direction, maybe raising a little bit the bar and opening, for the sake of transparency, what are the reasonings that we have incurred to stamp that a project was not feasible. I think it's a good way to show the work we are doing towards that direction. So this is more or less the reality there. And a couple of weeks ago, also New York DPS has issued an order for us to also analyze how the companies could add value with batteries for improving reliability. Which means that they are looking to their project this is my interpretation, okay? They're looking to the process and seeing, how can we improve that, and how can we bring more the utilities to propose solutions, to make studies and propose solutions in order to leverage technologies such batteries and others that could help us going through the energy transition. But these are my 2 cents on this, the reality of the 2 companies that we operate.
So from our perspective, and none of the jurisdictions that we operate in actually has like UI established NWS processes by the authorities. So in New Hampshire, the company put forward its NWS screening process, same as in all jurisdictions that we operate in our last LCIRP, the least cost integrated resource plan, I believe is the right abbreviation. And as part of that proceeding, that screening process was accepted by the department with the settlement agreement with the Department of Energy that for a 3-year period, we would review to lower the threshold from $3 million to $1 million, evaluate how many projects in the $1 to $3 million bracket get screened and how many go to successful conclusion. If that is cost beneficial after the 3 years, then we would lower that. If it shows that that is not cost beneficial, DOE and DPU agreed to leave the limit at 3 and proceed from there on out. And that's also one thing I think we're proposing here as well. Setting these limits, and I think OCC and UI would agree with us now, setting these limits now and keeping them forever cast in stone shouldn't be the idea. So, maybe the solution is to say we set the limit at $1 million. We review everything that's, I'm copy pasting what we said in New Hampshire, everything between 1 and 3, and in 3 years we review the cost beneficial effort in this, if that's even worth the screening or not, right? And then if it changes, we can adjust. So that's New Hampshire. In Massachusetts, same process that we have. Again, it's $3 million cutoff. And just to note, it's all capacity related projects, capacity relief projects that we're looking at. We take asset condition projects off the table because a broken overhead conductor, it's a broken overhead conductor that needs to be replaced. We filed our NWS screening process there, I think in the rate case, as well as in the electric sector modernization plan. And so far, well, pending the order on the electric sector modernization plan, which is due either today or tomorrow, we have not gotten any significant, let's call it pushback or concern with them, how the process is set up. So those, and what we've seen in terms of where we are proposing or what we have done storage projects as non-wires alternatives is typically, as Mr. Rossetti has said, is the capacity projects, the high-end value projects, the more expensive ones, where the value the non-wires alternative can capture and offset the overhead cost of procuring and developing such a solution.
Okay. So is it a part of the suitability criteria that only capacity projects are? So is there restriction on the types of projects?
Yes. So the primary set of projects we screen for is capacity related. If you were to ask me what the ideal project is to look at, is a project with a very small capacity violation and a relatively expensive equipment upgrade that's needed. Right? You have a megawatt overcapacity on a 3-bank substation where you have to do a full rebuild of the substation to accommodate that megawatt, and you have an $80 million project for megawatt capacity upgrade. That's your ideal candidate for the non-wires alternative. And to Mr. McDonald's comment, that's where the non-wires alternative allows for the flexibility, because you can put a battery in that can scale up a little bit until it gets so big that you need to do the substation upgrade, and that gives you that value.
Yeah, but having said that, as you know, the project in Massachusetts in Provincetown was a reliability project, reliability resiliency, the P-town battery. It was designed and implemented specifically for that. One of the projects that Dr. Walker just mentioned that we're developing in Hyde Park, that is a capacity project that's intended to bridge the gap between when we can build a new substation, which is sorely needed. So it doesn't replace or avoid the need, but allows us to bridge the capacity gap. And substation was delayed for other reasons. Yeah. And then the third project, interestingly enough, is a power quality project in a substation that has very high DER penetration. And it's also filed in the ESMP. And under NWA, there is being developed to mitigate some of those issues in a very special case with industrial customers. And as you know, we filed several projects, or 2 projects we filed in Connecticut that are capacity-based projects with a secondary use case of resiliency.
So that was, I think, Mr. Freeman, you sort of answered you started to answer, or at least address the question I was going to ask next is, so it's not strictly capacity projects. We can look at resilience or reliability type needs in certain circumstances.
Yeah, we have. The record shows that we have. So it would be disingenuous for us to say it's just capacity. Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Yeah. Sorry, no, just to add, there's some set of possibilities that NORs could be used. And I mentioned at the beginning on my opening that we have currently 4 projects, NORs going on under UI, and 3 of them are batteries to improve resiliency to critical loads. So it's a usable asset to that. But one thing that I bring some experience from Brazil, and there we approved a reliability battery for our regulator to improve reliability in a small village, very touristic there, where the traditional solution would be a transmission line and a substation. And we used the current feeder to put a battery there, and it improved a lot the reliability of that region. However, we are not somehow comparing apples to apples. The benefit that a substation and a line brings is, well, steady. It's, let's say, the gold plate, the gold standard for the reliability. However, when we look at the improvement that we had on the historical and what we got with the battery with a much less cost, it was like what made this being approved for us to build. So I bring to my point that here we're trying to establish, very some criterias for the projects to go through the formal NOR solution process. But to my view, the companies have the knowledge and the willingness to, in their screening process, to find this as well. Because I cannot, for instance, he mentioned about the maintenance. So for asset conditioning, 99% of the asset conditioning, non-wires wouldn't be an alternative, because we need to replace the rotan poles, the cross arms, and all of this. However, there are exceptions, and then we need to treat these exceptions as exceptions. For instance, Pleasure Beach, this is one project that another project that we're doing. It was like a cable replacement in the end of its useful life, and a very, very small load on Pleasure Beach. So a battery, and in addition to a microgrid, a PV plant there, made the solution happen. So here we are talking about the general rule, and it's important for us to establish some general criteria that could not hold back the companies and delay projects. But my statement here saying that non-wires and batteries could be useful for many other applications, but we just need to take care if we are not treating the exception as the general rule. And in general rule is, I go back what you were saying in the beginning, capacity projects, reliability projects, somehow resiliency projects is where a battery, we're talking about battery, would make more sense. And in my view, if we start to adding we start to opening more this, we are seeing more projects being analyzed through the formal process, but the rate of increase of approved projects won't increase. And in my view, we need to pursue the opposite, increase the acceptance rate. I'm just making up this phrase here, but increase the acceptance rate because it means that the process are well established to define the opportunities and make these opportunities go through as a non-wire alternative.
Thank you. Back to Eversource, about the DOE agreement, how is that, what were the terms of that agreement, or how was that agreement reached to look at projects from 1 to 3 million?
So that's a settlement we reached with the DOE. That was just part of the proceedings where the company and the DOE talked through the concerns that the DOE had on this. And that proposal basically was reached as a compromise to say that we will test that hypothesis, whether the lowering of the threshold from 3 to 1 million makes sense, with the agreement that if documentation, and we're keeping a record of all those projects and what the results of the NWA screening is, if that does not yield a positive BCA, holistically, the effort put into the screening versus the savings of any potential found. So theoretically, you can find 2, but you've spent 5 times more finding those 2 than the savings, and you move that threshold back up to 3, and then that stays in place. So that was kind of the idea of that agreement, to test that hypothesis.
Okay, thank you. Attorney Wheel or Mr. McDonald, do you have any thoughts on that? That process, that was the New Hampshire process?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm still struggling a little bit to just get the exact concern here. I mean, right, I still think you have your internal screening processes and they're probably pretty effective at screening out likely and unlikely opportunities. And, you know, the requirements for filing and the process are just that, you know, just because something meets the criteria as a likely opportunity, if it is the case that, oh, this doesn't pass our internal screening criteria for X, Y, and Z, you know, I think the vast majority of cases, everyone be like, yeah, that makes sense. That's understandable. That shouldn't go out to bid. So, yeah, I guess I'm struggling a little to just figure out what the exact concern is there. Because if you're doing it anyway, to me, this seems like largely a reporting exercise saying, yeah, we've done it and we're memorializing the decision and the process that we use in the decision criteria, why it's screened out.
Yeah, so I think this goes back to what Mr. Wheel had mentioned, what we proposed as a potential solution to discuss is if this is just a reporting exercise for unlikely and potential, and we can proceed with our process and projects as is, and don't have to wait for the NWS process to conclude, that's a different story. Our understanding was that these, even unlikely and potential, are under the review of the process monitor, whether they go out to RFP or not, which imposes those delays. Now, if that gets clarified in the final decision and the process that Pura puts out, that that's not the case and that is simply reporting, that's a different story, right? And that wasn't the impression that the companies were operating under the way this was set up at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you for the discussion. We're coming up against the time here, so I wanted to kind of raise for discussion a final topic. So I wanted to ask a few questions about the NWS pilot proposals, the battery storage proposals in docket 220605. And I'm wondering if the Eversource team could give a little bit of background on those projects and describe the grid needs that those are designed to address.
No, love to. So we originally filed 3 proposals, one at the Firebrook substation. All 3 are meant to address a capacity need at Firebrook substation, at Rocky River, and at Campbell. They were all very similar in nature. Based on the 10-year forecast, each of these substations is projected to be overloaded by somewhere between 2.5 to 6 megawatts by 2031. And to address that capacity overload, we would at some point need to upgrade those transformers. This project was seen as giving us the ability to delay or defer that upgrade. And so based on the time value of money to recoup some of the cost. The projects was sized at 2.5 megawatt for two of them and 6.5 megawatt for the third in order to address that capacity overload, the maximum overload that we would see by 2031. But in designing the projects to connect to the distribution line, we saw an opportunity to provide secondary value by designing them as microgrids to be able to provide backup service to a number of town critical facilities in each of those three areas, including I don't think there was a hospital, there's a police station, fire station, and some other town essential services such as drugstores and gas stations. And so we designed a microgrid area that could plausibly be kept energized by each of these batteries. And the operational paradigm was set up such that in the primary use case, particularly during the hot days of the summer, if there is a failure of one transformer at the substation, then the batteries would provide sufficient capacity to prevent the second transformer from being overloaded. Outside of those hot summer days, which constitute maybe the 20 to 30 days of the year, then the batteries energy would be reserved for a microgrid application. And as such, they were sized at around 10 megawatt hours, if I'm not mistaken, for each of them to be able to provide enough energy to serve about 70% of the load in the microgrid during a larger grid failure.
But to put them into context of the discussion we've been having for the past hour, Mr. Freeman, correct me, right? These are all substation capacity projects that the batteries are addressing?
Yes.
And they're all in the tens of millions of dollars of capacity projects, right? So again, this is kind of what we're arguing for. Those kind of level of projects fit the bill for an NWS evaluation.
Right. So just to elaborate, so we say reliability and we use reliability and capacity interchangeably, which might be confusing. Each of these projects were meant to address a projected capacity deficit at a distribution substation. But we cast it as reliability because if you don't have enough capacity, you eventually have a failure of the transformer, which provides reliability risk to customers. So.
Okay, understood. I'm wondering if you could describe when those needs were first identified.
If my memory serves me well, they were all identified after the summer of 2021.
Okay. Yeah, and so I did have a quick clarifying question. So you mentioned those are designed to address capacity violations that are happening in 2031. Is that correct?
Projected to occur in 2031. Now, so the peak of those capacity violations, the design was for the overload in 2031, but the overload actually started before 2031. Probably around 2028, we would begin to see overloads hitting a peak around 2031.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful, but still, I kind of just want to get a clarification on this line in the original proposal just for Campville, although something to the same effect is in Rocky River. But in the original proposal submitted, and in the case of Campville resubmitted on May of 2024, the company states that the station peak demand is projected to exceed 100% of the load carrying capacity in the summer of 2023. So according to the proposal, basically the load carrying capacity is being 100% exceeded, or 100% of the load carrying capacity is being exceeded already. That started in the summer of 2023. And so I just kind of want to square what I'm reading in the proposal with what you're saying here.
Right, and this is specifically for Campville, right?
It's for Campbell and also for Rocky River, although I know that proposal was not resubmitted.
Correct. And this is not unusual for projects that we develop. We identify a capacity need, and we also identify mitigation measures, because we know ultimately the long-term solution may be to upgrade a substation transformer. That takes a couple of years to get the project going. And so if that project is delayed for whatever reason, we identify measures, and these measures typically are transfers to adjacent substations. And so we've been transferring load, and in the case of Campbell, we're upgrading an adjacent station. I think it might be West Brookfield, and we'll be transferring load to that station. And so via several progressive load transfers, we would control the overload until a point where we don't have any more moves, and then we actually need to build a new substation. And so the battery gives us an additional move that we can make to delay that eventual upgrade.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and that's helpful. I'm just wondering if when we're talking about the time of need suitability criteria, if the company would make those same considerations when going into the grid needs filing in terms of determining what the timeline is for this grid need. Would they make the same considerations of measures they could take to push the need out a little further to maybe allow for the process?
Okay, so let's be careful with our terminology. The time of need is a time of need, right? And that's the time when the substation or the equipment is exceeding its thermal capacity, if we're talking about capacity needs. The in-service date is a different thing. And so for the Campbell substation, we are moving that in-service date of the eventual solution. But the time of need for when we need to have a solution, that was already identified. And we're just now developing interim mitigation measures because in-service date doesn't match the need date.
Okay. Okay, I understand. Okay, thank you. So just another question that I have is, would under the company's proposed suitability criteria, would the Campbell, Rocky River, and Frybrook proposals or grid needs, would those have qualified for the NWS process, or how would the company have treated those in the annual filings?
Yes, they would have qualified.
They would have qualified. Okay. Thank you. I have no more questions for me. So thank you for the discussion. Unless anyone else has any issues they'd like to raise, I think now would be a good...
Can we quickly bring up one point?
Yeah.
I know we're coming up on time, but I also suspect that we might need less time for the second topic compared to the first one. There was one question in the room, I think, where the companies filed joint comments on the DER integration, DER connection project, like customer triggered projects, whether they be included in the NWS evaluation or not. And I think that's still a topic we'd like to discuss.
Okay. So I think that our understanding is they would be included in the grid needs filing, and we could consider further going forward their suitability through the annual process. So if the company wanted to make an argument in the annual filing, they would do so there.
So maybe then we just bring up a bit on like what our position on this is. So at a high level, for DER interconnection, those are customer paid for projects, right? And the intention, as I understand it from the order for this process, for the NWS process, is to save ratepayer funds on this. However, it's a ratepayer funded process for customer paid projects that we're looking at here. So I think that's a bit of a disconnect in that regard. In addition to that, if I'm a solar developer and I'm filing for interconnection, again, I'm bringing up my example, I'm doing this in April, and the company's like, hold a second, I have a January filing for an NWS process I need to go through before I can give you a statement And again, a fully ratepayer paid for process to find an alternative solution to a customer paid interconnection. We see a bit of an issue with that constellation, especially as we're currently going through, and I don't know the exact docket number, people might know the NRES interconnection cost allocation with the group studies discussion. Don't quote me on the docket number. From our perspective, developing something like an interconnection fee in $1 per kilowatt range, what's being contemplated there is a much more effective mechanism to get the developer of the solar site or any other generation to willingly pay for their own non-wires solution. So if I have a 5 megawatt solar site and I have to pay 500 kilowatts interconnection, it's very cost effective for me to co-site a battery and only ever export at 3 megawatts and have a 2 megawatt battery co-sited. I avoid the system upgrades. I don't pay the $1 per kilowatt fee. And the ratepayer is never touched in that exercise because they do the math on their own. So I think that's a much better approach to looking at customer-funded interconnection process rather than running it through this process again.
Okay, understood. That's helpful. And I might ask if anyone would like to respond to that, and also whether this came up during the process initiation phase and the stakeholder working group meetings.
Hi, good morning. My name is Maritza Estremera Jimenez, and I am the Non-Wires Solutions Program Manager for UI. I would like to support what Gerhard said, Mr. Walker, in terms of customer-funded projects, even to elaborate a step further. Beyond DER, if there are, let's say, for example, customer-funded expansion projects, for example, Sacred Heart University down in Fairfield decides to expand one of their buildings or develop a new site, that project, even though it's fully customer-funded, would have to go through the non-wire solutions process. So that's something that we want to get ahead of and ensure that we don't delay customer projects, knowing that we still have the what's the word, the reliability or the obligation rather, sorry, to connect those customers. So we want to make sure that we're staying ahead of that situation as well.
And one other comment is, right, I think the way the BCA is currently being contemplated, since those are not ratepayer paid projects, your BCA would be coming back basically negative at all times because you don't have a positive impact on the ratepayer, which is deferral of distribution or transmission capital to the ratepayer is the biggest topics within the BCA as it is. So putting these projects through this process, just again, it just creates overhead, time delays, additional work that needs to be done. If there's an interest in terms of, visibility, again, to going to Mr. Wheel's earlier comment, that's a different discussion. We're happy to have that if there's a need to provide a bit of visibility there on what projects were done for what customers. We have to, of course, discuss what customers want to be made public about their interconnections that they've made. But putting them through those processes, they'll never pencil out in the end because the customers will optimize their own interconnection to the point that it makes sense to them already. And for us to then find a second optimization on that interconnection, again, through a ratepayer funded process, doesn't make much sense.
Yeah, well, to support this one, as I mentioned in my previous comments, somehow I understand that for the sake of this formal process, the filings, we should consider on the suitability criteria the categories of projects that are more, willing to have more potential to add value. As I mentioned, such capacity, reliability, resiliency, and this is for the sake of the formal project. However, I understand that for the sake of visibility and being able to disclose what we are doing internally to make feasible, make viable batteries, we, for instance, could disclose, as I meant, we could have a lower bar inside, analyzing all the projects, not going through this extensive process that takes time. And we are discussing a lot here about the timing of the things. And then we could find, as the example I gave, Pleasure Beach is something that if the companies have to file over this process, all the maintenance, in my view, it doesn't make much sense because like 99% of the projects are just replacing poles, replacing cables. So our asset conditioning process for projects. However, there are exceptions, and we could have, a softer, let's say, process, this reporting, and our screening, internal screening could be tighter, and then we could find all of this the way that we found Pleasure Beach, and we found other projects that we, in the correct proceedings, we request funds for doing that. So I think to end the position of UI here is that focus more on filing through this extensive process, the categories of projects that are in general more suitable for being on wire. So customer funded, maintenance, automation, all of those types of projects that are listed here too. I understand they do not add value to the process if they also need to go through through this process. However, we could analyze them internally in our screening process and make them visible to stakeholders on what was assessed internally.
Tom Wheel from OCC. We agree, and so I think with Mr. Bonbright, as a basic rate design principle, that the ratepayers who are paying for anything should commensurately benefit from what they're paying for. So I think in the aggregate, we agree generally that it probably doesn't make sense in many circumstances it's probably just not the case that at the end of a properly conducted benefit cost analysis on something like a customer funded process, that it would make sense for it to be for the total cost of undergoing the entire process here and the total costs, the whole kind of the balance of costs and benefits probably won't pan out. I think we can agree on that. And there are probably plenty of other examples of that too. But I think that I also don't think that it's as binary as there's no such thing as a customer funded process that can derive deferred or avoided distribution investments down the line, or that derive no benefit whatsoever to all other ratepayers. The extent to which those benefits compare to the overall costs, that's a question that needs to be answered for sure. But I guess I'm just saying, I think we at the OCC are on the same page. I think this is all sort of just a more granular way of saying, if a project doesn't make sense in terms of if the costs outweigh the benefits of doing it, then it shouldn't happen. And I think there are probably categories of projects where that's the more likely outcome than not.
I think that, and just one thing, Mr. Wheel, when you're saying the cost, right, that's the cost to the ratepayer. So especially customer funded projects where there is zero cost to the ratepayer, it gets very hard to justify that process.
Maybe, yeah. It's actually interesting you bringing this up makes me realize in our next time we go through another electric rate case, I'm interested in whether there are any administrative costs on the EDC end that are in base rates that do go towards the review and analysis of customer funded projects. So, but yeah, generally the amount, the cost all ratepayers pay should balance out with the benefits they receive.
Okay, thank you for the discussion. I think now is a good time for us to take our break. So let's return at 11:05, and we'll continue with the rest of our agenda. Okay, thank you.
It's are cold.
It's so cold in here.
It is. But Monday was better. All people had to count about
Yeah,
the air conditioning.
yes. I think
But, yeah, you're right.
that's such an engineering way. I think
I think they just have it set to being full.
we have a lot of, I work in the building. We have this problem. It's embarrassing, frankly. We found to have those. This is all summer and all winter, but especially in the summer, it's freezing in here all the time. And we're out here advocating for exactly. Yes, I don't know. We also don't have solar on the roof of the building. There's a lot of.
Should we set your thermostat?
I agree. Well, we don't know where the thermostat is or who can. There's a lot of, we have a lot of problems with it.
Oh.
I know. No, you're not. I don't know. I'm like, Sarah, I'm like, Hold on. Oh, I'm warm today. It's here. It's freezing. Oh. I know what I'm doing. That's great. This is really good. Okay, I know. When I hit a certain point. Look good. It's the area. You know, I'm sure. Been through it. Oh, yes. Well, I'm glad. Just that. Yeah, they'll know they're arrested. They're early bird.
Early.
Wow, no, and it's just needs to meet in person, yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it wasn't that bad. I'm I'm in Brooklyn, actually, so yeah, a couple hours, but yeah.
Couple hours of traffic, I guess.
Uh,
I don't know.
What's that?
Probably not a lot of traffic coming this way.
Not too bad. Getting out of the city is never painless, but yeah.
I'm sure you get almost the Parkway.
What did I do? So blindly followed
Yeah.
Google Maps.
Yeah, just wherever they tell you to go.
It changed me a couple times due to like different constraints. So I started up on the Parkway, but I think it rerouted me a little bit. Yeah. Of course.
I feel like it's colder now that we went out and came
Yeah,
back.
okay, all the body heat left the room or something.
Oh, you didn't tell me about the trip.
Oh,
I'm excited.
yeah, of course.
I'm curious. You
So
wanna-
actually not much in Europe. We were in South America and Asia. Yeah.
That's. Oh, my goodness. I feel like it's my first goal is like Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll go from there. Maybe South America and Asia probably last because it's like.
It's far.
longest
Well, that's
distance.
why we're like, well, if we have months, we should just go really far. It's also like the jet lag is hard. It's like a 13-hour difference. So trying to do that in a 2-week vacation would be very difficult, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Right,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I was talking to a guy.
My wife is Polish, so I've been up there a few times. So. Some cousins up there.
All right. Thank you. And I think we can reconvene and go back on the record and move to topic 2. All right, Mr. Butler.
Thanks, Chair Gillette. Laura, could you get to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'll give a brief overview of topic 2, the annual data filings. 4 specific aspects of the NWS process require data disclosure. First is the screening process, understanding which grid needs can reasonably subject to a competitive NWS solicitation. Second, allowing NWS solutions providers to shape responsive bids to benefit the distribution system. Third, evaluating responsive bids to meet a grid need and understanding the reasons for the selection of a winning bid. And fourth, creating a contemporaneous record of utility decision-making for later prudence reviews. In the REO 7 decision, the authority outlined a data sharing framework which provides the necessary amount of information to support a competitive process while also allowing for the confidential treatment of sensitive data. The framework does not include blanket protection for any data points, but does identify data points that may potentially be redacted and allows the EDCs to request that specific data points be filed confidentially through a motion for protective order. The data sharing consists of 2 data filings due on February 8th of each year. First, the EDC data filing provides engineering and technical data on the distribution system, as well as financial and DER deployment data. And second, the grid needs filing summarizes EDC identified grid needs, sorts them into the 3 tiers we discussed earlier, likely, potential, and unlikely NWS solicitation opportunities, and provides additional information on the cost, project justification, and the EDC's recommendation on the project suitability for inclusion in the NWS process. So we have just an illustrative example of what the filings look like and what was in the decision on the slide. So we'll move to our opening statements from each of the participants. So I'd ask Attorney Wheel if you can get us started.
Sure, I'll give it a try. I guess I'll focus my comments on maybe positive comments on the issue of cybersecurity and how to ensure that data sharing is secure. I feel like the working group made pretty decent progress on this issue. I think like the conversation as I observed it at the outset was the EDCs were very understandably concerned about the prospect of putting information out there for obvious reasons. It also, I think, highlighted some things that maybe at least OCC hadn't considered, things like that, individual pieces of data might not be problematic in and of themselves, but that the entire collection of data might present cybersecurity concerns. But anyway, I think that what happened in the working group was that the EDCs had an opportunity to exactly lay out specifically the kinds of things that they didn't want, that they felt needed heightened levels of security. And I felt like the working group and the administrator generally did a good job, in my opinion, of coming up with solutions to try to manage those concerns. Not sure if we're entirely there yet, but I think that process worked well from our perspective. We certainly don't. I'm sure certain that Pura also isn't interested in enabling a cybersecurity issue. So we definitely want to make sure that it's possible to get through this process as safely as possible. I mean, one thing that we did raise maybe earlier on, I think we might have filed something in the REO7 docket on this, is that from our perspective, and maybe this is too simplistic a way to look at it, the EDCs regularly are in the day-to-day business of hiring contractors to perform work on their behalf, and they've come up with ways to communicate with those third parties to facilitate constructing, projects on their grid. So they're able to kind of transfer the data that's necessary to do that there. And we're just kind of looking for ways to replicate that and ensure that there's the same level of cybersecurity in the non-wires process. That's all I got. Thanks.
From the UI perspective, I would say that the data requirements in Exhibit A, I feel like we did reach a pretty good common ground during the process monitors technical meetings. We did go through each of them, identified which ones we thought were confidential. And then also during the June 20th technical meeting, we did reach good consensus where we made a very clear distinction that Exhibit A rather, of the annual filing will only be available to Pura, to the process monitor, and any information that would be required or that we would release as part of an NWS competitive solicitation. So there's two bulks of different system data that we would be providing, one for the process monitor and for Pura, and then a separate one for the competitive solicitation. Once we have an NDA, non-disclosure agreement with the data security writer fully executed, we would make that information available to the developers. So I think from reading REO7, there was some bit of confusion, but I think we finally settled that down during the June 20th technical meeting. And from the UI perspective, I do feel that this item, we might be in pretty good shape in.
Yeah, I'll just echo the thoughts of the previous two commenters. I think we made a lot of progress along this axis, along this issue during the initiation phase in the technical conferences, and we're likely have several details to settle, but I think it's in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, I'm going to echo the same thing, and a lot of thanks goes to the process monitor for facilitating those meetings. especially Exhibit A, the companies had filed an overview of what we would consider as confidential information and whatnot. And I think that the key thing to distinguish here always is there's two sets, right? There's the project-specific data set that goes to the bidding entities. And that is basically all the information that entity needs. But nobody in the general public needs that level of information for every station that's out there. That's information that's only important for Pura to do the prudency review and to have that visibility, and by extension NV5, or sorry, Optima Energy. Got the name wrong there. And I believe, right, you signed, or we went through the NDA discussion with the process monitor, and the process monitor signed all the NDAs and the cybersecurity writers. So we're in a very good position there.
Maybe I'll start. Steve Capozzi with Authority Staff again. Mr. Walker, that filing was that the April 20th filing with the table?
Yeah.
Okay, that's right. And just a quick question about that. The data classification column, what does that mean? Or how is that determined, the data classification? Like, where does that factor in terms of, whether something should be protected or not?
I'll start with that one. So the operations side will determine how sensitive the data is, and they apply the classification levels. Those are coming out of our policies that we're using. Some more highly restricted, some less restricted. It's all based on sensitivity. Once we know the classification, then and this is why this process works, more sensitive, more security controls. Less sensitive, less focus on controls. It's a risk-based program. So we'll leverage those classifications when we evaluate who gets it, the proposals, what they need to demonstrate for controls based on the sensitivity of the data. But the engineering will classify the data based on the risk of how sensitive it is in totality of what's being given.
So okay, thank you. How would we determine the difference between something that's labeled restricted versus internal use? So restricted, I assume, would be more sensitive, but where's, the cutoff or the, how are you making that selection? Do we know, or?
So, and you'd probably struggle to do that as there's not like a 0 point some number cutoff limit in there. So the way we looked at this from when we went through the classification was, the first question was, has this information been made public before, right? If it has been made public in an unredacted filing, then that information was noted as public. So that's where this comes from. Then the next thing is, if that hasn't been made public, it's internal data. And then the question comes up, is that internal data we could make public, right? That's when you see, for example, item 4, it says internal use and not requesting restricted filing, because we could say that's data we've never made public, that's internal data, but we could make it publicly available. And then there's the other topic, internal, and we wouldn't make it public, or restricted information that we're definitely not making public.
Okay. I'm going to change gears, and I hope we don't, well, we'll probably go back to the first topic that we were discussing earlier, but with the suitability criteria, as they were set in the REO7 decision, how many projects would we see? Do you have it offhand, or can you tell us how many projects we would see in the grid needs filing? Quantity, number?
And I just consult David.
Sure.
Do you happen to know, if we do the $250,000 cutoff, how many projects would need to be filed, roundabout ballpark?
There we go. I don't know the total number offhand, but it's hundreds of projects that would fall in the 250,000 for sure. easily.
From our perspective, one exercise that we did, considering not only the threshold in financial threshold, but also the timing. Another thing that is important that we discussed, a project that is a need date that is within at least 36 months ahead. We got more or less 20 projects.
It's around between 15 to 20 projects that would be included within our grid needs filing. But I do want to say, UI's service territory is different than UI and than Eversource's. So just a small caveat with that. But when we did run that example, that's what we came up with, anywhere between 15 and 20 projects.
Can I clarify, was that, you said that was excluding projects that where the need was less than 3 years?
Correct.
So if you were including those projects, essentially all projects, how many would be in this filing? So no, so the cost threshold is down to 250,000 and there's no 36 month.
I don't have that number offhand, but I would have to look it up and can certainly follow back up.
I'm trying to understand is, so I read, I think in the company's joint comments that if the suitability criteria were not modified, that there would be a delay in the filing. And I'm trying to get a sense, maybe I can just ask this more directly, what the source of that delay is. Is it the number of projects? Is it something else?
So the source of delay would be twofold. First, we would file all our projects through the annual filing. So we would do that February 8th, and we would have to wait about 6 months to get the responses back in August to determine if a project would have to go out to RFP or not. So that is one of the sources of delays. Then the second piece to that is once we do issue out an RFP, it does take some time to work with our engineering groups to establish a competitive solicitation template, the data that the developers will need in order to develop their proposals, and then also once we do the BCA, select a winning bidder, there would be time also required for the construction component of the project. So all in all, we would need at minimum 36 months in order to get a project from soup to nuts, from the point where it gets filed to the point where it gets constructed and placed in service.
Okay, yeah.
And just small comment, I think like one of the considerations here is also in the total numbers of projects, right? Goes back, I don't know how many staff Mr. McDonald has at hand, but if we hand him hundreds of projects, I expect that the 6-month timeline to get these out to RFP and review is probably also optimistic at that point.
Okay, so I'm a little more confused now than I was when I asked the question, but I think I probably asked it wrong. I thought I had read in the comments, the companies had stated that there would be a delay in the initial annual filing. And is that what we're talking about here?
Do you
Or-
have the?
And is the delay in the filing of the grid needs filing, or the delay mentioned, you want me to refer?
Yeah, you have the
I was
page,
just
so
looking-
take a look at it.
I was just looking for it right now and I couldn't find it.
So I think
But
I think I know the delay you're referencing. So we were chatting about the 36 months if it's not established. As if we're operating right now, the REO7, and we would have to do a filing, we would end up filing projects that would be required next year. Now, from a timing perspective, we wouldn't be able to do an RFP for that project. It wouldn't be feasible to do the construction. So that's why we said if we don't have that timeline suitability of 36 months, it would delay the annual filing because we wouldn't know what you would want in the filing.
Is this page 15 you're referring to?
that's the first place I think I saw it.
Let me pull this up.
So it said The company's proposed, so this is time of need suitability criteria proposed. The company's proposed that the time of the need to be addressed by an NWS must be beyond 36 months to enable a successful non-wire solutions integration. The lack of resolution to this item will result in the delay of the non-wire solutions first annual filing due February 8th. So that is just because of the uncertainty around, I'm still failing to see how that first filing will be delayed by that.
Let me give this a shot and hopefully we can answer this. So, I mean, the first filing is slightly different than the continuous annual filings, right? Because once we've got this process established, the incremental new projects is going to be 1 year worth of projects, right? We file February 8th and then next one. So there's a 1 year turnover of projects that get added. The first filing can capture a lot more projects, and because it's not just nowhere it says any new project you've determined since February 8th, 2024, right? So there's a lot more that goes into that filing. And so by imposing that short timeline, some of the projects that were determined a year and a half ago with a 1 year or 2 year lead that are coming up to being very close to being done or being kicked off might end up in this filing. Right, so that's why for the first one, we're saying pull that level up so that the projects we're about to sign the contracts to roll this out don't end up in this filing, as they're like 95% done with engineering and ready to roll. That problem kind of alleviates itself as you're having that reoccurring process, right? But the first one is very unique in that regard.
Okay.
I hope that
I think that did. Yeah.
answers it. Okay.
Okay, so there was discussion earlier this morning about the company's internal screening process for non-wire solutions. So if so I think this question might have been more appropriate for this morning, but I'm going to insert it here now. What kind of output could be presented in a filing from that process? What information, and could the companies submit their screening, process, whatever materials they have for that into the as a correspondence in this docket?
Yeah, I believe to answer the last question first, yes, there is an at least speaking for Eversource, there's an NWA framework document that I don't know what docket we probably have shared it or yeah, so I'll have to dig up where, but happy to put it on the record here as well. It's out there and we've used it before. So that's not a problem. In terms of what the outputs look like, the screening tool delivers a couple of outputs. So first, it'll show clearly the capacity deficits. So what are we looking at? Megawatt hour? How often per year are we expecting this to occur? And then we have the ability to screen through energy efficiency, demand response, storage, solar, local generation assets, fuel cells, you name it, different technologies. And in the output, basically, you get a scenario evaluation of different technologies. You can say the most feasible is storage plus solar. This and this is the size. This will get you on the forecast horizon, 5 years, 6 years out. That's how big you'll be able to make it. And this is the benefit cost analysis associated with it. And a breakdown of the benefit cost analysis based on the deferral value of the capital investments, the original ones, including the revenue requirements calculations. I believe we've just recently submitted in the renewed filings for Campbell and Frybrook. We added that into the BCA calculation. So that level of detail is definitely available.
Okay. And that the company's continuously, so with the grid needs filing, that's an annual filing. But the company is continuously evaluating projects internally for non-wire solution screening.
So every time a project that meets the threshold criteria needs to go to project approval, it needs to have a section on project alternatives. And one part of that is non-wires alternatives. And that then includes a screening of the most feasible technologies. As an example, that typically always includes energy efficiency, storage, what can be done in terms of rooftop solar. Those are the classic candidates that we look at.
Is the tool specifically just for, it's not just for capacity needs, it can be for others, meaning resilience or things like that?
Yeah, so the primary focus is on the capacity. We've discussed this earlier. That's where we see the most likely candidates. But you can definitely use it for other use cases. So, and one example, if you're looking at resiliency, right? So say you want to scale a battery to run whatever your load is in a microgrid configuration, the tool would allow you to figure out how big that battery needs to be, what the cost of that battery is, and what the dispatch would look like, and how many hours you could back this up on a normal day. And mechanically speaking, might be going a bit too much into detail, but essentially all you're doing in the tool is, other than having a 62 MVA transformer that you're setting as a capacity limit, you set that to 0 because your transformer's gone and you're operating in microgrid, and then the tool shows you what your load profiles are without that supply, and you can model a battery and solar against it. So that's perfectly possible, yes.
Yes, please.
So and on behalf of UI, our process is slightly different on that. I'll go back to the planning process. So in UI, at UI, when we identify a need, the first step that we call IP1, and we describe this under the RIO3 docket we can bring to the record here as well. On what we call the IP1 gate, IP1 level of approval, is the first conceptual solution for that issue. So we found a problem, being reliability, capacity, asset conditioning, whatever the problem, a solution will be addressed, will be thought to address that problem. So the area that is making the study will bring this project to the IP1 level of approval. This is where the group assess that they actually assess if the need actually exists, and this is a tangible need, and if this first technical approach is reasonable. When this is approved on this gauge, this means that the area that is developing the solution should detail the solution. So first, you have just a broader scope on what the engineers understand that is the best solution for that problem, and you have a broader range of costs. After this IP1 approval, the technical idea is feasible. It goes back, and then the engineer drill down to improve costs and then explore alternatives. So when we go to the next step, that is IP2, there is the moment that we check for the non-wire alternative is feasible or not. So between the IP1 and IP2 is the moment that the engineer, let's say, he or she will drill down that specific solution and other alternatives, and being as other alternative, a non-wire as well. And then when these projects come for approval on the IP2 level, it must be justified, whatever the alternative that is being put for approval, it's the best one. And in that moment, as I mentioned before, for projects like 250 that we internally assess the project, the engineer will need to answer why a non-wire alternative is not feasible for that, and why other alternatives are not feasible for that. And that's why he or she is pursuing the approval for that given alternative. So that said, it's not a screening process that we have like a many loads profile. Is by initiative that we understand if for a given issue on the grid, a non-wire or other alternative are the most effective for that. So this process is continuous. So we are always identifying needs and approving solutions for those needs. And so that could be a mismatch on the dates of the filings that occurs once a year. But this is how we proceed internally, and we are able to find opportunities to develop non-wires.
When you say a mismatch, you just mean, does that mean you're sort of doing the not screening, but you're running this evaluation sort of on a rolling basis?
Yeah, because well, there's a cutoff date for that we need to go to look at our portfolio, make a cutoff to file this, and on that moment we could have needs that are IP1 level, and we weren't able to assess if a non-wires is feasible or not, and we will have IP2 levels that we are more sure that a non-wire is feasible or not. So we do this cutoff, and this is what we are going to show on the filing. However, as we move on, an alternative, for instance, the process move on, we could find out that maybe for a problem, non-wires is something feasible that makes sense, or the other way around. So the mismatch is, sorry if I use the wrong word, but I mean, this is a cutoff, and our process is a continuous process that we might have see changes depending on the solutions that we are designing.
Okay.
Just like one thing, just Eversource is similar for our plan work, similar process. That's why that 36 months, timing up, it's, initiate, then we, project development and ultimately design. So it's along the way, we're refining those scopes, refining those alternatives along the way. That's really for plan work, but there's still a significant amount of work then it's not planned within the year that occurs, just so you're aware. That's the other work that we obviously have to execute on. That's 250,000 or 500,000. You'll still see a project document that documents why we did that and how to do it, but it won't follow that kind of timeline and evaluation.
And Mr. Composer, if I might just pile on a little bit, and I appreciate what Mr. Rossetti went through, because it's really a good faith effort. I just want to emphasize that we really make a good faith effort to analyze the projects. On Dave's side of the shop, it's the smaller projects. On my side, it's the large projects. And so it's important to understand the process. As I said, it's codified in our planning guide, but every engineer, whenever there's a project that is suitable, and I'll let Mr. Walker, Dr. Walker, say what the suitable criteria are, and they are listed in that planning guide. And once that project meets those criteria, they must take it through the NWA screening tool. And each engineer is trained in how to use that tool and produce the outputs. And the outputs, as Dr. Walker said, if you look at the Campbell filing, which is part of this docket, there's a snapshot of what comes out of the tool with regard to how the forecast looks at, produces a megawatt deficit, and then that's used to develop the projects. And then those projects that the engineers propose, those are now brought to system plan and work plan, where all of the managers, leads, and directors opine on that project, opine on the alternatives, and decide and investigate whether the alternative that is chosen is actually the right one. So there are several levels of investigation and assessment to make sure that we're not overlooking something. And that NWA is really the right alternative if it is. So I just want to emphasize that we really try in a good faith way to do this right.
Okay, would the non-wire solutions tool, can it be applied to smaller projects? If, I know we talked about the concerns about the timing of the non-wires process here. If that's addressed, is that tool usable for those projects, for smaller projects?
So the process in itself doesn't, on a tool itself, doesn't have a lower cutoff limit, right? If we want to look at a 2 kilowatt violation in the tool, it's perfectly possible to do that. Right now, like I said, when we run it internally, we have the $3 million cutoff, and we're looking for capacity projects. And I think we have a need horizon of 3 years in there. So to Mr. Freeman's point, it's typically the projects in his shop, all the substation and major capital projects that fall under this review process. But as we said, like with the DOE in New Hampshire, we're going through lower limits. Now, $1 million isn't quite as low as we're contemplating here, but yeah, you can go down all the way. Again, I'm anticipating where you're going with this. Hopefully, I'm right. Doing it, screening it through our process is definitely a faster way than waiting until February 8 and submitting it and going through the stakeholder process. The process monitors process. But we also want to make sure that we keep certain levels in place even within the company, because that's, again, engineering overhead that is required to do this. So as you're thinking about that, if that's the idea that the utilities internally screen this with their existing processes and provide detailed documentation as to yay or nay why they made that decision, it shouldn't be taken as a bottomless approach where we can just go to $0, for example, and just run everything through, because trade-offs on overhead. One totally, or not totally, but slightly unrelated topic I wanted to bring up, because in your earlier question, Mr. Capozzi, you were talking about the timelines, and we were talking about page 15. One question or one thought on defining the time of the need, whether that's a 1 year or 18-month or 2-year time horizon, is to pin that to the grid needs filing. And so if a project that is found in April has a due date of September the following year, that would be a 9-month due date time horizon from the filing time. It might be more than a year when we find it, but since we have to wait till we file it in February, so I'm just putting that out as you're thinking about those timelines and the feedback you've received this morning, to perhaps pin those timelines to the filing date, so that projects that are identified very early in the year following a filing have a more, I don't know how to phrase this, but they're less likely to get caught up in that process, because if they're needed a year out and they're needed in March the following year, that's a month after the filing. So then the timeline is just looking at a month, and so it doesn't qualify. So it's just a thought to put that in there. I think that wasn't quite clear. So, and I do believe we put that in there somewhere as a proposal, but I just wanted to bring it up because we had the question about the timelines.
And just in addition to what I just explained in UI, it will be for sure, we could analyze any project in our internal process, because as I mentioned, it goes through approval through these gates, and then we have the opportunity to go to the engineer that is studying the project, go analyze a non-wire. The point is that it's important to establish some also internal thresholds in order to not analyze every project, but the ones that, okay, there's a sense to this type of project to be analyzed. So yeah, we could internally have, let's say, the bar low, a lower bar, as I mentioned previously, because internally this is a continuous process and we do not need to wait for approval or to go through a formal process to file those specific projects. But we would have the documentation to support our decision there.
Okay, that was very helpful. Did any other Attorney Wheel or Mr. McDonald, did you have any thoughts?
Tom Wheel from the OCC. The only thing I have to add is I can help Dr. Walker out and identify where the Eversource NWA framework was filed in 17/12/03 REO7 as a supplement to RSR 13 on April 5th, 2021. People are looking for it.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
No, I have nothing to add.
I think that's all the questions we have. If we're open to have any other discussion from the participants
So,
or any.
as I said, I mean, I was going to take us quickly back to the Exhibit A that was up here. And just to verify and on trying to understand where Pura staff is on this, because we didn't get any questions on it. So essentially, if I'm allowed to ask a question, do you see any issues how the process monitor and the utilities have come to a conclusion on how we'd like to handle Exhibit A? Or is there any feedback for us for that process?
We didn't have any questions on it. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jim. Yeah, oh, we didn't have any questions on it at this point.
I did have one comment, and it was going back to the timeline suitability. And it had to do very close to what Dr. Gerhard Walker was chatting about timeline, ensuring the 36 months suitability timeline. We would also like for projects that have gone through the process. So essentially projects that are getting reviewed right now and going through our internal planning process to be grandfathered in. And the reason for that is that at this point, we're going to be incurring engineering costs, potentially permitting costs, and we do not want those projects to then have to get reverted back through the NWS process to then incur additional costs. I will say as an example, I helped establish the non-wire solution alternatives program in Maine, and we did not have that rule, and we did end up delaying inadvertently many projects. So as a lessons learned, just posing that as a suggestion here, that we would like to grandfather projects in that have gone through and we've already spent money prior to January 1st, 2025. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I did, Tom Will from OCC again. I did have one thought to add that's sort of responsive, I think, a little bit to that comment and to some of the discussion this morning, which is just that, at least from the perspective of OCC, the way we understand like where the rubber meets the road on this program in terms of cost recovery is that it's not the case, as we understand it, that a project is ineligible for cost recovery if it doesn't go through the non-wires process. And it's our understanding that just like any plant that a company is seeking to enter service, whether it's gone through this process or not, at the end of the day, there's a prudency review. And at the end of the day, if there's a good reason, like the reasons that have been raised today, for a company to not delay, if it would be needlessly costly for a company to delay a project because the timeline for implementation is so short that waiting a year wouldn't make sense, then from my perspective, not making any guarantees about OCC's future positions on any particular project, but from my perspective, the framework kind of already takes care of that in principle, because there is sort of, as I understand how it works, the company could say, here's the reason why we didn't process this through the, like, why we pursued this project on our timeline, as opposed to going through the whatever barriers we're discussing now and that are procedural. All that said, I mean, again, we should try to make this work, and we should try to make this streamlined and as sensible as possible on the front end. But I just wanted to sort of say that out loud, that as we understand the framework now, it's not the case that there's like a guaranteed disallowance for anything that doesn't wait to undergo this whole process.
And I think to some extent, Mr. Wu, we agree with that, right? That's not how we're interpreting it either. But there's still this open question: if the EDCs in the current way it's set up were to determine to proceed with the project based on the reasons how they've interpreted the order, and then it goes into review by the process monitor, and we've started development, and say the process monitor were to disagree with us on that interpretation of the project, we're at the risk of the non-recovery in the end, because that might be interpreted for non-prudent investment. So from our perspective, right, anywhere where it gets very or even remotely close to being up to discussion, we would wait, of course, until the process monitor review. So simply by having that review of the decision in there, we're essentially forcing the hand for us to wait until that is through, to make sure that the projects we're initiating don't end up not recovered.
And I think one point on that, we agree with what Gerhard just said. In my opinion, I think we are establishing something here that is, as I mentioned at the beginning, very interesting. We leverage on these technologies to host more DRs, to provide better service to our customers. But to my view, everything that is new has uncertainties, and we are discussing here loads of uncertainties. And a good approach, I think two good approaches would be, okay, we understand that this is very comprehensive, but in my view, if we narrow a little bit down this, trying to focus on projects that are more viable, theoretically more viable, we would start this project in a more this process in a more effective way, having what I call the acceptance, a higher acceptance rate, in my view, which is good for the cost that this process will be incurred. So starting, let's say, tech industry use this, the minimum viable product. So starting in a way that maybe with a small set of projects, more likely to happen, and then we work on that. And the second is the constant review on this process, because again, we are learning, we are in the learning curve. I mentioned about New York. This was a 2016 process, and like 8 years later, we are seeing the results. We do not need to wait 8 years to evaluate if the process is attaining the expectations. So starting small, humble, I think, and being more confident on the projects that can pass through, and also the commitment that we should review this process in a timely basis to ensure that to analyze and to be critical to see if the bar that we are establishing right now are higher or lower, and how can we adjust this for, year after year, improve the outcomes for a process such as this. So yeah, my comments on that.
Okay, thank you everyone for the discussion. Before we close out, I want to remind everyone that we have 2 additional tech meetings to discuss the remaining topics that were identified by the EDCs in their request. And we stated those in the notice of tech meetings. On September 19th, we will reconvene for technical meeting number 3 to discuss the topics of the competitive solicitation process and EDC developed materials. And on October 1st, we'll reconvene for technical meeting number 4 to discuss the benefit cost analysis framework. So I'm looking forward to those discussions. And in the meantime, stakeholders are encouraged to file any comments on today's discussions in docket. And that's it for me. So I'll turn it over to you, Chair Gillette.
It for me as well. Thank you very much for your participation this morning, and I hope it's warmer outside than it is in here. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.